hear us? This one works? Great. So good afternoon. My name is Rick Heilig. I'm with Cisco. I'm the moderator of our panel conversation this afternoon. In the next about 40 minutes, and we're running a tight schedule. We're going to wrap it up by 6. We're going to have a little bit of a conversation around sustainability. And it's not really me, it's our panel that's going to talk about it. And we just sat down without following the order on my list, so I'm going to just go from top to bottom, even though we didn't sit in order. No, it takes too long. I'm going to start with Honorable Glenn Murray, if you can just, everyone knows Glenn, Minister of Training, Colleges and Universities for the Province of Ontario, and MVP here, most important. Then, lady here, Christina Werner, Director of Intelligent Communities at Waterfront Toronto, relatively new in her role, but also been very active in intelligent communities at Windsor. Then Patricia McCartney, Professor of Political Science, University of Toronto, Canada, and Director of Global City Indicators Facility, and there's a few M's, and the John H. Daniel Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design, and the Director of the Global Cities Institute. Busy lady. Right next to me, Jeff Kate, co-founder and executive director here at Evergreen. We met Jeff just now at the opening. And last but not least, at the end there, Joe Lobko, partner at DTAH, architect of Evergreen Brickworks, or one of the 7 we just heard, the lead, and of lots of other great projects and communities around. So what I wanted to do is kind of ask a similar question, but I have you all respond to it. And I want to start with you, Jeff, since we're in your house here today. And as we call the panel, Sustainability Panel, maybe we can help define what sustainability means to you, because it's a very loaded term. So could you explain the word sustainability in the context of you and Evergreen Brickworks?
It's a loaded term, and I don't want this definition to be the definitive one by any stretch, but certainly sustainability is about the 3 main ideas of economics, social, and environmental, and the balancing of those. But of course, in our realm, it's got a heavy orientation around the environmental dimension of it, and trying not to draw from the future today from the future. In other words, not indebting our future by drawing too much out of the environmental systems today. The way it lives as an idea is and the problems that kind of are behind that idea is really about human behavior. And so we'll get into that more later, but we're looking for other thoughts on that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I want to ask Joe, and I know we have to just hand him over here, the mic, sorry. Since you're one of the designers here, maybe you can kind of add to that from a sustainability perspective, the design aspect of concepts that you've done here, and how you can take that into your community design and developments around the country.
Sure, maybe just a couple of points, I guess, is that around the question of sustainability in Canada at the moment, we're a country with aging infrastructure, aging buildings. Ontario has the oldest average age building in Canada, and we have an infrastructure deficit, I think, that increases because our infrastructure is just getting to that point. And so to make impact on climate change or emissions, those kinds of things, our biggest challenge is in our existing communities. And I think community revitalization is at the heart of our sustainability challenge in Canada today. And therefore, why this project is in that context kind of meaningful, I think, is that it's about taking an old thing and making it new again. And that's what we have. We have to do a lot of that. And we have to do it smartly. And we probably have to do it on the, depending on a whole lot of people participating and taking stewardship of something, and then really owning it, and then it's truly sustainable. And so I think this project has elements of all those things.
Great. So maybe, and I realize the way I wrote this, the ladies last, that's very rude of me, but Glenn, as Joe talked about kind of the sustainable communities, you being a minister and an MVP here, a lot of it is about community. How is this kind of form of sustainability in a project like this, for instance, kind of impacting or setting a tone for the province?
Well, I think a lot of it is about education, which is very hard, because I don't think people understand the context in which we live our
lives. And there's a lot of mythology. One of my pet peeves is when people say that we're living in the age of urbanization in cities. In fact, we're not. We're actually, I would say, de-emphasizing urban environments and rural environments, and we're living in intensely suburban, low productive environments with extraordinarily large houses and transportation that is extremely inefficient in both the amount of fuel it takes and the amount of land it takes. So if you go back to 1926 as a baseline, when we first started sort of the electricity and oil economy, by the time I was born in 57, our population had doubled, our CO2 emissions had doubled in 1956 and 1926, our energy had just more than used per person had just doubled, and our GDP had tripled. If you go to 2006, our population is 4 times as much, our CO2 emissions are 6 times as much, our energy consumption per person is 8 times as much today, and our GDP growth is extraordinary. It's 18 times what it was. And that 8 times as much energy as our parents has a lot to do with our appliance, land, road-intensive infrastructure. And that's the intergenerational imbalance. That's why we cannot use 8 times as much energy as our grandparents and about 6 times as much energy as our parents. I think we can be sustainable. That level of consumption is destroying the planet, and that has a lot to do with our urban reform, or the lack of urban reform and suburban reform.
So, Patricia, maybe you can briefly kind of explain what the Global City Indicators Facility is and does, and how what you somehow heard here is what you see around the world through your organization.
Just to answer the first question, which I had in my head, since you asked it, on the sustainability question, the way we enter through the prism that we enter into sustainable questions worldwide in global cities is around how to measure it. Mostly the definitions out there are fuzzy enough that it's very hard to get to a really good set of measurements and indicators around sustainability. So many people are struggling with that. We work with the United Nations Environment Program and Siemens and the World Bank and others around how do you measure sustainability. What do you mean by it? First question of yours, but then how do you measure it? Once you take it to a broad base of prosperity and society and economy, etc., and then try and bring it down to a green agenda, it's really, really difficult. So greenhouse gas emissions, for example, GHG measurement, looking at your charts, those are national statistics, right? And we try to get that down to the city level. At a city level, it's very hard. GHG emissions, the definition is still, how do you measure that at the city level? And then how do you then get to the sustainable city definition? There's a whole roster of metrics out there that aren't very good, and that aren't really comparable across cities. Toronto to Saskatoon, we can't really compare, let alone Toronto to Nairobi or Shanghai, etc. So international agencies are really struggling with this, and they're getting there. The Siemens Green City Index is not bad, but the data's still got patches and holes here and there, so we're trying to improve that. So our GSIF is not just measuring on sustainability, but that's how we think about it. So we're measuring a whole series, and we have 150 indicators that now 200 cities report on globally. So we have 200 cities across 73 countries that are reporting in on a roster of standardized, internationally standardized metrics. We're just going for ISO approval next week in Paris. Hopefully it'll be on the fast track for the next 4 or 5 months to ISO standard 2 metrics. Once those metrics are standardized, then we can start to actually put them together in pretty interesting ways to come up with that same graph that we have for Canada for cities. It's really an important challenge that I think all cities will face, including Toronto.
It's not just green.
It's not just green because that was the other half of my answer. So it's not just green because if you, in this particular economy that we're living in now, the volatility that we're seeing in Europe, etc., if you don't crack cities and prosperity agendas in a good way, Mayor Bloomberg said it, if you can't measure it, you can't fund it, you can't manage it. So if you can get that level of prosperity agendas in sync the green agenda, the social agenda, social inclusiveness, etc. That's really what we have, because political volatility and economic volatility are so much at play right now that the green agenda has to survive in the climate. So climate, but it does need to survive in that. So you need good metrics to force those issues to
I see you now. Glenn, you want to respond to that? Or? I'm just like.
I'm going to respectfully disagree, so I'll start a debate. I think we're drowning in data, and I think that data is very consistently collected around the world, especially in the OECD countries. The challenge is everything from city licenses to leasing. I mean, we did an exercise when I was at CY to try and figure out how much data you would need to gradually determine this stuff. The challenge is that almost all data collected in our society is not open source and it's producer-centric. So there are 17 different sources of data in Toronto that can tell you square foot by square foot what's being built, what kinds of businesses are moving in, what incomes are, what emissions are, what volumes are, and they come from all sources. There is no open source data set. Australia's done this much better than we have. And there is a collaborative project between my think Calgary, Edmonton, have to open source their public sector data. When I was Minister of Research and Innovation, there were two major projects that I funded that I thought were two of the most important things I've done in my 2 years of college. One was funding this place, which was to be an education place to convene, to educate, and to be a catalyst for change. The other one was funding something that's at Mars called the Regional Strategic Resource Center, which was basically asking Mars and a series of partners to open source all data that was collected. So, and it was structured very detailedly on structure of an urban, suburban, and rural form, and aggregated all of that data. So if you wanted to understand businesses, you can do everything from NAICS codes to impact assessments to business licenses issued by municipalities to all of the private sector data sources to Terranet. And you get a very accurate, granular picture. The problem is that academic, public sector, private sector data is so proprietary and so producer, so vested, nested, and untested that it's very hard to cross-reference or get it. That was an attempt to try and lead an open source society. It so far has not been successful because, well, they have the money, they haven't been able to leverage the money the way that everybody has, and they haven't created the broad partnerships to create open source data and metrics. Once you make that all transparent, all of a sudden things become more sensible. So I'll give you one example and then I'll shut up. The example is between 2005, and so we have all the data, there's no data shortage here to prove that, and between 1995 and 2005, we had 32 million square feet of office space by the same data collected anywhere else. That's more office space than exists in the entire city of Calgary. 90% of that was located a kilometer or more from higher order transit, GO Transit, or that. That continues. So part of the reason is that you don't build your tax base because that diminishes it. 90% of your new workforce has to take an automobile to work and not transit. And your transit ends up massively publicly subsidized because there's no ridership. That's a self-perpetuating thing. We still do not, anywhere in Canada that I can find, aggregate that kind of data to even co-locate transit facilities with the biggest reason people use transit, to go to work and come back. So even with the data that we have, we don't use it to do evidence-based transportation planning. You'll see a lot of that in the display later next door. And I think that's why things like this project and an open source project are that, because it really puts in effect public accountability. Because then everyone knows what the problem is. And quite frankly, a lot of that data makes some of the solutions self-evident. I think that's a part of the challenge in a civil society, is to make sure that people get more than a vote, that they actually get the access to information to be able to be critical and participate in public policy decisions.
So you talk about open source and data, and it takes it to you, Christina. I know you're new in the role, so not to put you on the spot, but you are working on probably one of the largest urban revitalization projects. A lot of it is new, existing land, but new, and where a lot of the things we probably talked about can be applied and employed and probably built on and learned. So maybe also a question for you as you look at Waterfront Toronto. What does sustainability mean there in kind of a big picture, and how do you see kind of what you heard here, and maybe a place like this, the jumping board platform for you to benefit from?
Thank you. And certainly I'm actually on, I was just explaining to our colleagues, day -12. I haven't even officially started with waterfront yet. So I'm speaking a lot from the Windsor Essex lens as well. And sustainability, one of the things that came up early on is that basically those three main pillars. And coming from Windsor Essex, the one that we really focused on a lot was around the economic sustainability and some social sustainability. We've really struggled with that. You know, we're one of the hardest hit economies in Canada, and we continue to struggle with creating new jobs. But bringing that opportunity of the lessons learned from that very different context to Waterfront Toronto, we have basically a clean slate to build best practices. So certainly the things that are learned from Evergreen and from other projects that companies like Cisco have been involved with and so on will be absolutely vital. So when I look at the waterfront opportunity, I look at how are we going to enhance education, how are we going to bring healthcare down to the waterfront, how are we going to be able to connect businesses to truly collaborate, and looking at those underpinning themes when we look at intelligent communities, building a new knowledge workforce, having digital inclusion, having true collaboration that is both genuine and purposeful. How are we going to have demonstrated leadership to move the community forward to the next level? And measuring that is going to be absolutely vital. We're starting with basically a clean slate, a baseline of 0. How do we make sure that that is going to be delivering that next generation community? So partnerships are going to be really key to that. And actually, one of the groups that I've been actively involved with is the Intelligent Community Forum. They've recognized Windsor Essex in 2010 as one of the Smart 21, and in 2011 as one of the top 7 worldwide. And this year, we hear some of the wonderful things that groups like Riverside, California, you take a look at some of their sustainability initiatives out there at the residential management level, it's quite phenomenal. And even their e-learning strategy, how they have digital classrooms for every child and every parent and every teacher have an ecosystem to be able to communicate and collaborate around their child's success. Those are the kind of things that I want to make sure that we're creating a sustainable community in every aspect. And environmental is certainly something that we want to leave a legacy for our children as well.
So, don't worry about it. Joe, there's not that many waterfront Torontos in Canada or North America where we have that kind of large playing ground, and there's a lot of either building by buildings being built or existing stock that has to kind of go through the same concepts. So how would you be looking at a living lab like this, or kind of deploying new partnerships and relationships of innovation to really drive sustainability design in communities?
Well, I mean, I guess this place has been said, is fundamentally a needed place to talk about all these things. But I wanted, I guess, to underscore something that Glenn has raised, which is that not only do we, in my mind, that community revitalization has got to be our focus, but it's a form of community, a suburban form. That's the predominant form, to Glenn's point, that this country is populated with. And it's not all homogeneous either. It has some differentiation. And so, just coming full circle to intelligent communities, I wonder about places like in Toronto, the inner suburbs, and a lot of people are wondering and talking about those places, but those places are now 50 to 60 years old. There's some of our first condominiums that are now failing. They need massive amounts of investment, but they're not communities that anybody's interested in. They have the poorest health outcomes. So you're going to live less and live less pleasantly if you live there. And it's the least walkable parts of our city. It's the least connected parts of our city. So that's our collective challenge, I think, and it's exacerbated because of its form. So how can intelligent communities, smart communities, play a role in places like that? So it doesn't become differentiated between affluence and haves and have-nots, but it's somehow facilitates some kind of social change we're after. I'm not sure what the answer is.
So maybe Jeff, take it back to you then, as you have kind of built this place and built kind of an ecosystem of companies and partners around you. What is it that you indicate a little bit at the beginning? What is it that you do to not help the Christinas of the world building new communities, but also the community that Joe talked about, so that we level the playing field and provide sustainability across communities across the world with transmissions?
Yeah, I guess that's a tough question to answer, quite frankly. A lot of the strategy that we developed here at the site began with this idea that you first need to be meaningful in your own community, and then you can establish meaning and a meaningful program internationally. So a lot of that spoke to the idea of engaging communities, families, citizens, in stuff that they wanted to do. Building a sense of community, creating a really attractive and engaged relationship with citizens that leads them towards behavioral changes, new patterns of behavior in the way they operate their day-to-day lives in a city. Some of that speaks to patterns of mobility, how we get around the city. Some of it speaks to food, and how food is a metaphor for something bigger than the simple notion of breaking bread, so to speak, physically. It's this whole idea of celebrating food, which is really about engaging across communities. And so the farmer's market down here was not just about providing a farmer's market where people could come and get their onions and carrots. It had a much more substantial role in trying to change people's relationship with food. And so a lot of our work has been about trying to change patterns of behavior at the individual level. And then at the international level, I think Toronto, well, I think this site, I think Toronto, and I think Canada, and I think somewhat embodied in our flag, and because there's so many international journalists here, it's hard not to reflect on the Canadian flag, the symbol of the maple leaf. There's a sequence there. The site, the city of Toronto, known for tolerance, cultural tolerance, its integration and respectful relationship across cultures. There's something in that sequence of success stories that we have an opportunity to leverage. And I think Canada has an opportunity to become a leader and model, by showing a way forward. We are far from being global leaders in relationship with sustainability strategy for cities right now. There's a long way to go. But we have some of the bones right. And there seems to be some strong intentions in play right now. This is going to be a competitive advantage if we can get it right. And I can virtually guarantee that if cities dismiss sustainability, as much as job creation is critically important and governance agendas are critically important, et cetera, just economic vibrancy is critically, if people don't get the sustainability agenda right, they will fail and they will fall dramatically into second-tier cities. The cities that survive and flourish in the coming decades will be ones that make a very strategic investment in sustainability agendas, because it's not about kids planting trees and the niceties of all that. These are ways of finding innovation and sparking creativity in the community around making stuff happen at the local level, investing in your community. I'm not getting that point quite as crisp as I'd like. My point simply is that this site and what we're doing at the Brickworks, at Evergreen Brickworks, the city of Toronto and Canada have something interesting ahead of us if we can get it right. And we're going to play our bit in that, and hopefully others will too.
So we kind of talked about environmental sustainability. We started, you touched on the social side, I think, a little bit. So if we look at the economic sustainability, and Glenn, when you just introduced yourself to me, you said they call you Mr. Productivity. And looking at how do we look at sustainability from a productivity perspective, and maybe take all these concepts to really drive innovation and economic growth for the community.
There was an interesting study done in Austin, Texas a few years ago, and I think the economics of sustainability are not understood. The reason we have high taxes and unfixed infrastructure is because we do not do design for economic sense and environmental sustainability. I'm not going to give you the number because I haven't confirmed it, and the number is so huge that I disbelieved it when I first heard it. But in my community of Toronto Centre, the assessed value of residential property only is in the trillions of dollars. So if you look at the average city block, if you took the Austin model, and you look at how many tax dollars are spent per block and per citizen in a mid-rise to high-rise mixed housing neighborhood, and versus how many tax dollars are generated, it's 10 to 1, 100 to 1 to the good of the government. As you go out to inner core suburbs, the balance is still possible. As you go out into low-density suburbs, you start to get a dramatic reversal, and as you get into mansions in rural residential and some of the new forms of cul-de-sacs you get a complete inverse, several tax dollars in for every tax dollar out net. When you actually look at the amount of infrastructure, roads, sewers, pipes, fire halls, all of that per capita, and you look at what you can afford, and you look at the ratios of the productivity, the inputs for outputs, the inputs in mid-rise, and it doesn't have to be condo tower. I mean, in fact, there's problems with the Bay corridor, absence of green space, corridor canyons, but those numbers are simply not sustainable. If you look at, we talk about all kinds of things in government costs, and I say that as a mayor who cut taxes every year, who came from the green left, and I think the only one who left a much smaller tax burden on my citizens by building the tax base, was because you have to rejig urban form. And if you had actually got rid of perverse subsidies and said that you cannot model development in energy use or in land use where there isn't a net positive relationship with the broader public, which means that I as a citizen can't build a home which imposes a net tax burden on everyone else for my life that someone else has to pay that I'm not going to, you would see a dramatically different urban form. A matter of fact, in the energy numbers I gave you, I think most people in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and early 70s in Canada had a really good quality of life. Most of us grew up. And most of those older suburban models worked. If you actually look at the energy map of when it completely blew apart, it starts in the 70s, it takes grip in the 80s, and also those were the worst built buildings in the history of Canada. I'm sure Joe will tell you. They were almost disposable. Matter of fact, if you ask any mayor in Canada, where's the biggest infrastructure problem? It's not the neighborhoods that were built in the 20s and 30s, it was the neighborhoods built in the 70s and 80s, so there wasn't even durability in the buildings, not just the environment. And that's the crisis. That's the crisis for municipalities. That's what's driving the cost equation. And that's what we continue to subsidize. We are still building, there are 71 million square feet of office space between Markham and Don Mills. There's 1.4 million square feet at the Vaughan Corporate Center. What's the transit infrastructure up to our 82 million square feet of office space in downtown Toronto? Where's all our transit infrastructure? Up towards Markham and Don Mills. Our least used subway in Ontario is the line north of Spadina. Less use than the Shepherd line. So you've got to start matching your transportation infrastructure. This is my challenge to Waterfront Toronto. 70% of people don't own cars. I live there. I live in a sea of parking lots, car dealerships, and the requirement for every high-rise condo going up in the West Island is to have parking lots. I have 4 stories of the condo I live in, and I don't own a car. I make money. It's the cottage industry. We'll rent them out to people. But like you've got to start aligning. Like even when people make different choices, you've got to create the infrastructure to do this. So why don't you lay tracks before you put streets sometimes? And then people, when they won't need a key to the car door, they give them a transit map. I mean, we're probably 40 or 50 years behind many other places in actually building, because transportation and land use choices aren't a consumer choice. I can choose what kind of soup I want in, what kind of meat I want to eat, but the built environment and the friction of travel. When you go back in here, one of the things that everyone should look at is the congestion maps for today, and then look at what the GTA looks like in 2031. And if you don't think that's a crisis, and you don't understand what the implications of that are in lost economic and GDP and billions of dollars in lost jobs, not just the inconvenience of sitting in traffic, you get an idea that this is an economic and environmental and an urban crisis all enrolled in one. And this display, I think, is extraordinarily important in helping us start that conversation.
Patricia has to really know that. We have the data that you didn't want to give.
No. Pat is a good friend and comrade in our team.
No, when you look at
anymore. I wouldn't
We'll
mind
change
just,
seats.
I would change seats. I think I should say 2 things. One is the importance of metrics, I don't think can be underestimated here. There are a lot of metrics, and we're overwhelmed with numbers all the time. So there's 2 things that we have to think about. One is how well are we able to have cities talk to each other on an even playing field, apples to apples comparators. The answer, until we started to build a standard metric globally, was there were none. When the World Bank started the program in 2006, they asked 9 pilot cities to tell them what they were measuring. What are the key indicators? They were all measuring the same thing. They're measuring transit and water and waste and GHGs and safety and education and health and aging populations, all of that, they're all measuring it. But because the definitions and methodologies of the indicators were all completely different, these cities could not talk to each other. So they came to Toronto. It was Mayor Miller at the time, convened the workshop of the 9 pilot cities. So it was Sao Paulo, Bogota, Seattle, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. They put all their indicators on the table. There were 1,100 indicators. They were all gathering hundreds each of these indicators, all on the same things. And when they laid out the 1,100 indicators, there were only 2 indicators that were similar, that were comparable. Even though they were all measuring the same thing. So they couldn't talk to each other. They had no ability to draw lessons globally from each other, to say what the best practices were. So if an evergreen solution comes up here, we need to have a playing field for Toronto to be able to say, look at us relative to others, or cities to draw an exchange. It hasn't happened before. So this global standardized platform that we're building, and the reason we've gone from 9 cities in 2009 to 200 is because mayors and city managers are increasingly asking for this standardized set of metrics that they can draw comparators. They want to be able to talk to each other. Mayors are trying to leverage funding from senior levels of government. They're trying to measure, they're trying to leverage funding. So increasingly they're being asked, well, how are we doing relative to our peer group? How are we doing relative to the Vancouvers or the Montreals or the Chicagos or the Dallases of the world? So now, they can start to say, the city manager can take the data and that they've been putting into this website of ours for 2 years and say, here's the picture. Here's how we're doing in our peer group of cities between 1 million and 4 million, etc. So standardized metrics are extremely important for lesson learning for cities to actually talk to each other. And until we get there, we're rolling it out to 1,000 cities by 2020. And the ISO standard will help us. Once we get to 1,000 cities, the cities can actually talk to each other and not talk at cross purposes and actually draw lessons and learn from each other. This is the first time this has been happening. There is a lot of data that it's not used by. The second part of the issue, though, is, and you're right, there's so much information and how you use it. A lot of it's just either private or it's not being used well. So we're trying to move, because we're now at a turning point in the indicators facility at BT, we're now at a turning point. So we're trying to build out the metrics into research, into really sound analytics to help mayors and managers tell the story better. And we're trying to move towards visualization of that data so that we can actually have a model cities alternatives being played out with sound metrics. So we're now about to launch the Global Cities Institute at the university. And it will have the Global City Indicators Facility as the flagship program. But then we're moving to visualization theaters and model city labs, where we can actually start to use these metrics to actually draw analytics and storytelling and comparative alternatives. What alternatives to the suburban core city models? What are the alternatives if we did this? With metrics, you can actually move the story forward. So that's where we're moving. And I have some materials here which I'll be on if you're interested in one of this new institute that we're launching. It's quite an important movement forward at the university.
Sorry, I'm going to get signals and soon I'm going to ignore them, but I do have one quick question, and since I'm moderating, I think I can ask it. Glenn talked about transportation infrastructure, and one not necessarily mentioned is connectivity in terms of internet connectivity as an infrastructure. So maybe last question to you, Christina, and then we have 1 more minute for 2 questions. Is that okay? From the audience. When it comes to addressing all the issues and the challenges you hear, environmental, social, and economic sustainability, and building roads and parking lots and all the things that we are used to building because it's concrete and we can touch it, how important is connectivity becoming to kind of separate or elevate a community like, for instance, from Toronto or Windsor to address this issue?
Absolutely, and broadband had been underplayed for a significant amount of time, but of course now it's really at the forefront, and it's that critical infrastructure, just as much as sewers and roads and things like that, that has to be present in order to be a world-leading community. That's one of the wonders that coming to Waterfront Toronto, and the infrastructure is being put in place best of class right from the get-go. concern in terms of broadband and taking care of sound. We focus on the application, we focus on making the data more useful that's collected from the various different sources and building content pieces and so on. And when we look around the world at the world-leading intelligent communities, we know that the sustainability pieces of it and technological pieces of it and the knowledge workforce components, we put all that together. Real world-class intelligent communities have much faster rates of economic growth than any of the other cities. So it's vitally important that we get this right and we get it right quickly and with the correct partners around the table. And I'm looking very forward to learning more as a new Torontonian from Evergreen and my colleagues as well. So I hope that answers your question, right?
Yeah, no, that's great. And I know we're running out of time, but maybe if we get 2 hands, if people have a question, we have only time for 2 questions. Who has a question? Nobody?
Future assault.
Yeah, that's come on. Oh, there's no question. Oh, there you go.
You know, there's this little aphorism that I heard that came out of the Ottawa debate on the census, status of the census, which was who needs to ride and you know, there's a perception that so much of our decision making is driven by ideology and not by data. And to your point about responding to that, we have too much data. But also, I think, a sense that consumers armed with the correct information will make informed decisions. We somehow all believe that. That's key to what our future is, I think. So, at the USGBC conference, the first time ever held outside the United States was here in Toronto. And 2 big themes emerged at the end, was my impression. This is the United States Green Building Conference. One was the revolution in metrics and measurement. And the whole, you know, in my field, it's just revolutionized the way in which we can measure and bring things. Though it's still very much transformed. And the second is the visualization, as you say, or the communication of that information to inform opinions. So my question is to Glenn, which is, okay, so we're making all these advances technologically around information, but we're swamped with it. How do we get it to intelligently inform consumer decision and to use it effectively? Because it's key, because otherwise we're driven by ideology constantly.
I'd like to answer the question. I think there's a challenge that I think if you actually said that the 2 big myths about transit, build it and they will come, and they don't, build it where they will want to go, where they want to go. So we in Canada think we're building fields of dreams and cornfields. I think the other place is that transit has to lose money and be massively publicized. Only badly planned transit has to lose money. So what are the economic costs of it, right? So what does it mean if you have 71 million square feet of clustered office space that there's no transit use? And you've got transit lines going to places where there's virtually no office space and no drivers. Well, that's an issue that has huge consequences because it means that the modal splits are going to be terrible, the congestion is going to be terrible, and you don't have those dollars to spend, right? And I agree with Patricia that comparative data is useful as long as there's some utility to it. Like I can tell you that out of 30 cities in Canada, Toronto is second only to St. John's in ranking for worst amount of green space. That doesn't tell me as much as what is the consequences in my constituency of Bay Street and Yonge and Jarvis not having any green space at all, being the worst in Canada, relative to crime or City Place, you know, which has the risk of being a planned crime neighborhood because of the lack of amenity. The question is, data-wise, and I think this is important, I think we agree here, is what nobody think we do? So what's useful data that helps you plan a 24-hour neighborhood? What are the ingredients in the neighborhood that are sufficient to reduce crime? What's enough transit and what's sufficient co-location and alignment of modal splits to actually shift modal splits? If you don't have evidence-based policy to be enough, then getting 80% of the way there is often in urban planning the same as getting 10% of the way there. There's been a dismantling, not just of Census Canada, but the National Roundtable on the Environment and Economy, which was one of the best aggregators of economic and environment, has been dismantled. And what's happened in the last 10 years in Canada has been the dismantling of much of the data aggregators that take data and turn it into knowledge and wisdom. And we have gone through the second wave in Canada of the dismantling of all of the infrastructure we have in the private and public sector that actually aggregates data into evidence-based policy. And it's costing us a small fortune every year because we pay billions of dollars in reduced lifestyle and in taxes. There's no bigger driver of tax costs in this country than unsustainable planning and what I would call the brown approach to development.
That was the only question that I was asking. This was too long. No, I'm just kidding. I know we're out of time. So I want to thank everyone in the audience and thank the panel. They're going to stick around, I think, a little bit if there are some questions. And I want to close. Thank you, Jeff, for not only our partnership that we announced today, but also for hosting today. And I'm going to give the mic to you because I think you're going to direct us to our next part of the program.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not going to give up any big surprises, but some of them have hinted at already. Speaking of visualization, speaking of best practice, speaking of local context and trying to find action at the local level to make change, we have a big unveiling in the building next door, which you haven't been into yet. It is debatably the most dramatic asset of this entire complex, although I think the valley in the back is, personally. The space next door will be an unveiling that was initiated in a very, very specific way by our partnership with Cisco, but before that by Minister Murray with some real leadership in a commitment made by the province. But I'll get into the details of that in a minute. We're going to head, which way? That way? Okay,
Yeah,
so I was going to take you in the wrong direction. So we're going to go those doors.
We're going to go out these doors, except I'd like to ask the panel, anybody who's interested, to go for a photo up in the Cisco
We have time
Innovation
for that?
Center. We're going to do that quickly. And then I invite the rest of you to go out these doors, register, get your drink tickets, and then go into the Wholesome Gallery where the bar is set up.
Yeah, and then, but don't leave. Don't just stay and drink. We do want to show you an amazing exhibition. Yeah, don't leave, don't stay and drink. Stay and drink. If the choice is between staying and drinking, stay and drink.